Hi, this is Jeff Blauett, technical agronomist with Cooperative Farmers Elevator, and on this week's Field Friday segment, we're out in the beans here, was looking over some things and kind of wanted to revisit something we've talked about in the past, kind of what the late season look and what we could be seeing out here. Some of you may or may not be familiar with or have experience with it, but we can still find areas of Gall Midge larvae damage. We've talked about it before earlier on in the season when you're out around these fields and you see some plants that are wilting and don't know why. Go out and diagnose it, break over the stem at the ground, they crack off. Maybe you can find that little orange larvae that we've shown and talked about before. But again, I've gotten a few calls here late season. Not sure what we're seeing, but a lot of this stuff is still Gall Midge damage. The challenge now is the plants have been dead for a while in a lot of cases, and the orange larvae are gone. They've basically dropped to the soil and are laying eggs basically for next year's generation, right where they were at. So I wanted to show a few things. What if you're out looking to see how fields are progressing as we get closer to trying to figure out when the combine is going to need to be rolling. We may be out looking at some fields and see a few things. So I want to show what that might look like, especially if you haven't seen it before and it's kind of new to you. So basically what your damage is that bunch of orange little larvae chew on that inside the skin of that stem until they basically do enough damage and either that stem breaks over or it basically just is kind of slow growing. Maybe it doesn't die or maybe it doesn't crack off, probably hurts that plant some until we get a late windstorm maybe, or maybe it doesn't crack off. We've got instances where I can see there's damage and the plants haven't broken over yet. So here's what we're looking at, the aftermath you might say. Here's some, a few pictures of some dead plants that are out there, been dead for a while. Maybe they didn't even break over, they just died because of the feeding damage inside the stem. Remember that little fly that emerges, it injects those eggs and basically those larvae hatch kind of in that bottom inch of the stem, typically at ground level. That early season when it does that, it's looking for those rapidly expanding stems about soybean spraying time, and those stems, the skin kind of cracks, and that's an entry point for them. But you can see here I've got some of these plants, kind of a little bit of a close-up after you break those stems over, either whether they're dead or not. Here's some of the brown damage from that feeding. That's why those stems get real brittle and break off. You get into even when these beans are starting to get towards maturity, a stem that doesn't have damage like that will not crack off like that. It's not a brittle point. But when there's feeding there, that point is much more brittle and it will crack. If you look at some of these that have been dead for a while, sometimes there can be some little, it looks like white mold growth on those stems right at that, where the feeding damage was, right at the ground level. If you're not familiar with it exactly, it's different than the sclerotinia white mold that we deal with a lot. I've got pictures of both of those to show what the difference is. The Gall Midge damage and the white mold that you might see on the plant is basically right on the skin of that stem, and it's always at the base. White mold is more of a fuzzy mold growth that isn't always right next to the stem. It grows and kind of gets a big moldy area on that stem, and that's rarely ever at the bottom of the stem. It's usually up wherever the flowers that got infected first. It might be 4, 6, 8 inches off the ground level where that white mold is basically working on killing that plant with a different disease in a different way. But kind of wanted to show what some of those things look like. Again, you're not going to find the larvae in there in the stem anymore, so that makes it a little bit more difficult to identify if you're not really familiar with what you're seeing. And it is interesting to note the location if you're seeing some of these dead plants that just don't look right, or areas of the field. Generally, the Gall Midge damage is more on the edges, maybe the next to the crop line. We've talked about that before. but they don't have to be. If they've been around for a few year cycles, they can get population heavy enough where they continue to move farther and farther into the field. We've seen some of that where we've had these damaged areas of fields in the past, you know, a number of 5-6 years. So it's not always at the edge, but usually it's worse on the edge. Whereas white mold, anybody that's got white mold history knows that that's usually more soil type related, heavier soils in bottoms, not necessarily on edges, actually not on edges typically very much. So the damage location might be an indicator too. But just wanted to show some pictures and kind of follow up what this late season stuff might look like if you're seeing some of these things out exploring your beans, just to kind of show you what we're seeing. So with that, that's this week's Field Friday segment, and we'll see you next week.